My desk was in the corner nobody photographed, third sublevel, records wing, past the intake scanners and the vending alcove that never carried anything a human stomach wanted. At a terminal so old the projection field had a persistent flicker in the lower left quadrant that I'd stopped bothering to report. My badge read Archive Auxiliary, Continuity Support, Non-Rotational. The Institute had taken one look at my transfer paperwork, Oral Continuity Archivist, Second Class, Kestrel Reach Frontier Registry, found no equivalent classification in 300 years of intake taxonomy, and filed me under the closest thing they had, which was clerical. I didn't mind. I'd grown up in my grandmother's back room listening to her take down testimony from people twice her age, watching her write faster than seemed possible, and I understood something about paperwork that most cadets who wanted to be pilots or officers never had reason to learn. The boring job is where the truth actually lives. Everyone wants to be in the room when something happens. Nobody wants to be the one who writes it down correctly afterward. So I filed. I cross-referenced. I built quiet, obsessive indexes nobody had asked for, because that was the only inheritance I had from her, and I wasn't going to let it go soft from disuse just because I was 16 and 11 light years from the room where she'd taught it to me. I still remembered the specific evening she'd shown me why it mattered. Two neighboring homesteaders arguing over a boundary marker that had supposedly moved during a storm, both of them certain, both of them furious, both of them absolutely convinced the other was lying. She'd sat them down separately, an hour apart, never let them hear each other, and written down exactly what each one said without correcting either. What came out, once she laid the two accounts side by side, wasn't a lie at all. It was a marker that really had shifted, in a way neither man had noticed happening, because each of them had only ever seen it from his own side of the fence. People don't usually lie, she told me afterward, wiping ink from her thumb. They just remember from where they were standing. Your job isn't to catch the lie. It's to hold both places at once, long enough to see the shape between them. I hadn't understood it then, not really. I understood it a great deal better after the drill. The Threnica, whose institute this was, didn't understand memory the way I did, and that was the whole shape of what happened. Their species carries something called the lattice, not a machine, not exactly, though the Institute's systems modeled it and depended on it. It's neural. Every 11 days, in a scheduled rest cycle, a Threnica cohort's dorsal nerve frills, soft, translucent, threaded along the back of the neck like pressed seagrass, synchronize with everyone they've been in close proximity to since the last cycle. Not thoughts, not full memory, just the emotional and sensory residue of shared events, smoothed and blended until a group of Threnica who'd witnessed the same incident from 6 different angles would wake up remembering, more or less, the same thing. It wasn't malicious. It wasn't even deliberate, most of the time. It was just how their biology handled the unbearable weight of holding on to a version of events nobody else agreed with. Consensus was comfort. Divergence to them felt like a kind of low-grade physical pain. Cadets described it to me, later, as an itch behind the frills that wouldn't resolve until the next cycle brought them back into alignment with everyone around them. Which meant a Threnica who remembered something differently from their cohort didn't usually stay that way for long. Not because anyone forced them, because it hurt not to match. It went deeper than any one incident, too. The Institute's entire historical archive, I'd learned in my first week, wasn't built the way ours was. A pile of competing, contradictory primary accounts that historians argued over for centuries. It was built from 300 years of successfully reconciled cohort memory, each cycle folding smoothly into the next, generation after generation of Threnica who had never once needed to sit with an account that didn't match anyone else's. It made them extraordinary at consensus and terrible at doubt. Their proctors would tell you, with total sincerity, that the Institute had no history of falsified records, and they would believe it completely, because a falsified record and a successfully reconciled one produced, from the inside, the exact same feeling. Certainty, warm and total, with the itch gone quiet behind the frills. I only understood any of this because of what happened with the drill. It was a beast-handling exercise, applied xenohusbandry, Tier 2, a routine one, the kind that ran every 8 days with a rotating specimen and a strict published containment protocol. The specimen that cycle was a Vantic, a 6-legged burrowing predator about the size of a large dog, calm as long as its enclosure's interlock stayed sealed and its handler kept a minimum 3-meter working radius. The senior cadet running point that day was Dreth Calvoran, a 4th year on the officer track, sharp, well-regarded, under real pressure. I'd filed enough of his paperwork to know his cohort had a placement review coming up and his drill times had been running long. I wasn't in the annex when it happened, nobody in records ever is, but I was the one who logged the incident report 40 minutes later, and I was the one who watched the case close, formally, in under 2 hours. Calvoran came through records himself, 40 minutes after it happened, to file the initial incident intake in person rather than route it through a proctor, which cadets almost never did, since the form took 3 minutes at any terminal. His left forearm was wrapped to the elbow, the medical wrap already showing a faint bloom of red through the outer layer, and his frills, usually a bright, confident amber, were pulled tight and colorless against his neck, in a way I'd later learn meant something closer to shame than pain. He didn't look at me while he filled out the form. He filled it out fast, in the clipped, over-precise handwriting of someone trying very hard to make the details sound smaller than they'd felt. And when he reached the line asking for a brief account of cause, he wrote equipment malfunction, sealed the entry, and left without waiting for a receipt. I remember thinking, at the time, only that he looked like a cadet in a hurry to stop thinking about his own arm. It took me weeks to understand he'd also been in a hurry to stop thinking about the 6 seconds before it. The report said, containment interlock malfunction, mechanical, no fault assigned. Handler sustained lacerations to the left forearm during specimen resecuring. Equipment flagged for replacement. Filed, stamped, cross-referenced to the maintenance backlog, done. 2 hours. For an institute that took 11 days just to let a cohort agree on what a shared lunch had smelled like. A formal incident closing that fast was like watching a glacier sprint. I didn't say anything. It wasn't my place, and more honestly, I didn't have anything yet. Just the itch my grandmother used to call the paperwork feeling, the one that showed up when a story closed too clean, too early, with too few of the small ugly details real accounts always carry. What I had instead was time, and a desk nobody watched closely, and, over the following weeks, cadets. The first one was Sela Aum, a first year in the same cohort as Calvoran, who came down to records 11 days later, the morning after her cohort's first reconciliation cycle since the incident, and asked, very carefully, whether archive auxiliaries were required to report anything a cadet told them. Only if you ask me to file it, I said. Otherwise I just listen. She sat across from my terminal for a long moment. Her frills, I noticed, weren't fully synced yet. A faint lag shimmer along the base, the kind that showed up in cadets whose cycle hadn't fully taken. She told me, plainly, that she remembered hearing the enclosure's manual override latch click, an audible, distinctive sound, different from the automatic seal release, about 6 seconds before the drill clock hit 0, before the exercise had officially started, before, by definition, anything could have malfunctioned, because the interlock hadn't been engaged by the automated system yet at all. I wrote it down. Date, time, her name, her account, word for word, the way my grandmother had drilled into me 1,000 times before I understood why it mattered. You do not smooth it. You do not compare it to anything else yet. You do not let the teller hear anyone else's version before you've captured hers whole. 3 days later, a second cadet came down. Terrell Vachon, different squad, hadn't spoken to Sela since the incident as far as either of them knew. His own reconciliation cycle not due for another 6 days. He remembered the same click. He remembered it at almost the same interval before the drill mark. He didn't know why it mattered enough to mention, he said, except that it had bothered him, a manual sound in a moment that was supposed to be entirely automatic. The fourth was harder. Ressa Tovain found me during the shift break, when the annex above records emptied out and nobody would see her sitting at a clerical desk instead of the mess hall. She didn't sit right away. She stood by the terminal with her frills doing that same pre-sync shimmer, arms crossed, and told me flatly that she didn't think this was any of my business, and that she wasn't sure she wanted to be the reason a fourth-year cadet lost his placement track over something that might not even be true. I'm not asking you to decide whether it's true, I told her. I'm asking you what you remember. Those aren't the same job. Yours is easy, mine's the hard one. She sat down after that and told me the same thing 3 others already had. The click, the interval, close enough to the same 6 seconds that I'd started keeping a running tally on a scrap of paper I didn't trust to any official system yet. What she added that the others hadn't was smaller and, in its way, worse. She remembered Calvoran glancing at the drill clock twice in the last minute before the exercise began. The way you look at a clock when you're deciding whether you have time to do something you shouldn't. Not malice. Just a 4th year under a placement review, doing the math on seconds he didn't actually have. By the 4th account, I had stopped being surprised and started being careful. I'd also, if I was honest with myself, started being afraid. Not of Calvoran, who I doubted even remembered my name, but of what happened to an archive auxiliary who filed a correction request against a well-regarded officer track cadet and turned out to be wrong. Nobody had told me to do this. Nobody had asked. My grandmother's rule had never once come with a guarantee that being right would matter more than being convenient. and I sat with that for the better part of an evening before I decided it didn't change what I was going to do with the paper already in my hands. I want to be clear about what I was actually doing, because it wasn't detective work, not the way the vids make it look. I wasn't accusing anyone of anything. I was doing exactly what I did every day, which was taking down what people told me, dated and separate, refusing to let the stories blend into each other before I'd captured what each person actually remembered on their own. The only unusual thing was that I kept a private index, cross-referenced by time, sound, sequence, because that was the one skill I had that nobody else in this building had reason to practice. The Threnica didn't take testimony this way. They didn't need to. Their biology did the reconciling for them, automatically, comfortingly, 11 days at a time. Nobody here had ever needed to learn how to hold 6 separate, uncomfortable, non-matching accounts in their hands at once and just look at them. 11 cadets, in the end, over 5 weeks. 11 separate accounts, taken before each cadet's individual reconciliation cycle could smooth their memory into whatever the cohort consensus was quietly becoming. 9 of the 11 mentioned the manual latch click. 7 gave a timing estimate close enough to cluster within a 4-second window, 6 seconds before the drill mark. None of them had compared notes with each other. I made sure of that, the same graceless, unglamorous way my grandmother used to make sure of it back home, by simply asking, every time, and writing down the answer, and never once telling anyone what anybody else had said. I didn't write a report accusing Calvorin of anything. I didn't think that was my job, and more than that, I didn't think it was true in the shape people would want it to be. Nothing in what I'd collected suggested cruelty or malice. Just a 4th-year cadet under placement pressure who'd released a safety interlock a few seconds early to shave time off a drill that was already running long, and then a system that had, whether by design or convenient accident, filed the resulting injury as pure equipment failure rather than procedural violation. I filed what I actually had, a standard records correction request, the same bloodless clerical form I used for misdated maintenance logs and duplicate specimen tags, attaching 11 time-stamped witness statements and noting, in the required one line of commentary the form allowed, that the interval between the recorded manual latch sound and the official drill start mark, across independent accounts, warranted review prior to permanent archival. I expected it to sit in a queue for months. Corrections requests usually did. Instead it landed, by clerical accident or plain rotation, on the docket for the next scheduled incident reconciliation hearing. A standing monthly review where the Institute's administrative panel processed exactly this kind of correction, in a chamber 3 floors up from records that I had filed paperwork for 100 times and never once entered. I was called in as the filing archivist of record, nothing more. I sat at a side table with my index open, expecting to hand over 11 pages and go back to my desk. The reconciliation hall itself was the nicest room I'd ever been allowed into. High, curved, filled with the same soft cyan projection light that seemed to run through every important room in the Institute. A dozen panel seats arranged in a shallow arc facing a central display well that hummed faintly even at rest. I'd filed the paperwork this room produced 100 times without ever once picturing what it looked like from the inside. It was quieter than I expected. Everyone spoke like they had all the time in the galaxy, because to a species that measured truth in 11-day cycles, they mostly did. The panel chair was Reconciliation Officer Vaith O'Soren, older, her frills a deep settled blue-green that barely moved, the mark I'd learned of decades of successful cycles. A Threnica whose memory had been in near-perfect consensus with her institution for most of her adult life. Beside her sat the panel's modeling system, the continuity array, whose entire function was to take incoming testimony and calculate whether it matched the expected shape of a Threnica consensus memory closely enough to archive without further review. It had processed 900 incident corrections that year. It had never once failed to converge. The proctor spoke about it the way you'd speak about a trusted elder rather than a machine. The array knows, they'd say, when a record is settled. And after 300 years of a population whose memory genuinely did settle on schedule, I understood why nobody had ever had reason to doubt it. It failed to converge on mine. I watched it happen on the projection above the table, 11 data threads, each one a cadet's account. Each one plotted against the model's prediction of what post-consensus testimony from a synced cohort should look like. Smoothed, blended, statistically indistinguishable from each other in exactly the way memories that have passed through a lattice cycle always are. My 11 threads weren't smoothed, they agreed on the thing that mattered, the click, the 6-second interval, with a tightness that should have been impossible for unsynced individual memory, while diverging wildly on everything else. The angle of the enclosure light, who'd been standing where, what someone had said afterward. Real, independent, uncomfortably, statistically real, in a way the array had no existing category for, because nothing in 300 years of records had ever handed it testimony this genuinely unblended. Osorin's frills, which had been that settled deep blue-green the entire hearing, flickered. A hard, visible stutter, the physical tell of a Threnika's own memory system encountering something it couldn't smooth over on the spot. She didn't ask me anything dramatic. She didn't need to. She asked, instead, in the same flat administrative tone she'd have used for a maintenance log, how I had obtained 11 accounts that had never touched a reconciliation cycle. I asked them one at a time, I said. Before their cycle. I wrote down what they said, and I didn't tell any of them what anyone else had said. Why? Because that's the only way to know if it's true, I said. Once everyone agrees, you can't tell anymore whether they agree because it happened, or because agreeing stopped hurting. I hadn't meant it as a warning. It came out like one anyway, flat, and a little hard-eyed, the way my grandmother used to say the exact same thing to elders who'd rather the record read comfortably than correctly. Osorin looked at me for a long moment with an expression I had no framework to read, and then she looked back at the 11 threads still failing, quietly and completely, to converge. The correction was entered without ceremony. Interlock release logged as manual. Timestamp verified across independent testimony. Procedural review opened for Cadet Calvorin. Placement track suspended pending outcome. No announcement. No apology to anyone, least of all to me. The equipment fault classification was struck from the archive and replaced with 3 clean administrative lines that would sit quietly in a database most cadets would never think to search. I went back down to my desk the next morning. Same flickering projection field, same corner nobody photographed. Nobody thanked me. That wasn't how the Institute worked, and honestly it wasn't how I'd have wanted it. My grandmother never got thanked either. That just quietly, permanently trusted by people who'd learned the hard way that she wrote down exactly what you told her and nothing else. Sela Ohm came by that afternoon, dropped a requisition slip on my desk, a replacement stylus, standard issue, nothing remarkable, and left without a word. Reading it twice, I realized someone had filled in the model number wrong. Deliberately, maybe. It matched, instead, an older archival model my grandmother used to carry, the kind that had gone out of production before I was born. I didn't fix the error. I filed it exactly as it was. Some things are worth more accurate than convenient.